Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we've put together the i5 760 with a GTX 660 and slapped in 8GB of RAM. Our question is, can it run Cyberpunk 2077? Stay around and we'll find out. This is a Tyrannosaurus Rex holding a GTX 660. The Nvidia GTX 660 was released back in September 13, 2012. It's based off the codename GPU GK106-400-A1. This is part of the Kepler family GPUs and is based off the 28nm fabrication node. The variant of the GTX 660 today we've got is from Gigabyte. This is the GV-N660OC-2GD. This video card comes with 2GB of GDDR5 clocked at 6008 MHz, running on a 192-bit bus. The GPU base core clock is at 1033 MHz and boosts up to 1098 MHz. This GPU requires a 6-pin Molex power adapter on the back, and recommended PSU for this GPU is 450 watts. The API is supported by the GTX 660. It does have functional level DirectX 3D 12.0, but it's mainly DirectX 11, OpenCL versions 1.2, OpenGL 4.6, and it does support Vulkan 1.1. Motherboard we're using today is from Gigabyte. It's the GA-H55M-S2H. The revision we're using is 1.0. This motherboard is an LGA 1156 motherboard supporting i7, i5s, i3s, Pentiums, and Celerons. It also has support for the X3400 series Xeons. This motherboard is not really a gaming motherboard, it's more of an office motherboard, supporting 2 channels of RAM with 2 DIMM sticks. This motherboard comes with one PCIe 16 slot and one PCIe X4 slot, but it has an X16 connector. It also comes with 2 PCI slots. The CPU we got in this motherboard today is the i5 760. This is the first gen i5 based on the Nalem microarchitecture. This CPU was released by Intel back in July 2010 and is based off the 45nm node. This CPU is a 4-core, 4-threaded machine. Its base clock is at 2.8 GHz and can max turbos up to 3.33 GHz. It has 8 meg of Intel Smart Cache and has a TDP of 95 watts. The RAM we're using today is Kingston KVR 1333 D3 and 9K2/8G. This is a 2-kit DDR3 1333 8GB kit. So basically the 2 sticks we're using today are 4GB each. We're using usual drives. We have one 120GB Western Digital Green SSD, a 240GB Western Digital Green SSD. We also have a magnetic 1TB Western Digital Green hard drive. Today's operating system we're using is the usual. It's Windows 10 build 2004. We've placed this on the 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. That is our operating system drive. Now, Cyberpunk's minimum specifications is Windows 7 or Windows 10 running a DirectX 12 card. Now, the CPU that is specified at the minimum by Cyberpunk, or the guys that make it, is the Intel i5 3570K or an AMD FX 8310. They've asked for 8GB of memory, which we have, and the Nvidia GTX 780 3GB or an AMD RX 470. So by the sounds of it, we're quite under. So we're not going to look like we're going to have a great gaming experience, but we're going to give it a crack. Now, before we get too far, we did run into one problem where this game wouldn't run. Now, it all comes down to the Advanced Vector Extensions, or better known as AVX. So our problem is that the Intel i5 760 doesn't actually support AVX extensions. Fortunately, there was a little hack where we run a hex editor and we changed a value to skip this AVX extension stuff. Basically, what you need to do is download a hex editor. We've downloaded HXD. Just look at the link below. We've got it linked in there. Copy the game to a temp directory or the exe. Open that up in the hex ed. Now what you want to do is go to search and now type in this address 1D70520. Now select 55 at the end of that line and change that to C3. Once you've done this, go to save as, and I basically just called it Cyberpunk 2077 noavx.exe. This hack only works for version 1.03 for Cyberpunk. We're going to do some benchmarks and then we're going to jump into Cyberpunk. Looking at the i5-760 with 7-zip. With 7-zip, the i5-760 scored 3,645 points for the single score core. For multi-core, we got 11,772 points. Now, these are all the CPUs that we've done at the OFFbit, so the single core score was actually pretty close to the i7-950, which makes sense because they're based on the same architecture. In multi-threading, we pulled out first for the 4-threaded machines, but sat behind the 8-threaded i7, which makes sense. Moving on to CPU ID's benchmark, the i5-760 got 284 points for its single core and 1,014.5 points for multi. A very strong single core and sat round with other 4-threaded CPUs for the multi-core. Lastly, Cinebench R15, the i5-760 scored 346 points. This set us in second position and sat in front of all the 4-threaded machines, but sat behind the i7, which is 8-threaded. So the big question is the i5-760 4 threads going to be enough for Cyberpunk? Moving on to the GTX660 GPU. So in Cinebench R15, the GTX660 scored 53.28 frames per second. It did outscore the GTX750, but lagged behind everything else. Moving on to Unity in Heaven, the GTX660 scored 834 points, sitting in second points behind the GTX770 by a fair chunk and just in front of the GTX750. Finally, 3D Mark's Firestrike, the i5-760 with the GTX660 scored 4,351 points, giving a very firm second place, lagging behind the GTX770 by about 2,000 points. Now, all these video cards are well under the specification for minimum, but at least we know what sort of ballpark we're playing with. The GTX 770 is not too far off from the minimum spec. Now, starting off with inside areas, the game actually played alright in 720p at low detail. Nothing fantastic, most of the time we're sitting about 30 to 25 frames per second. Now, when the scene got really busy, we did feel a lot more drop back, and there was an input lag at 720p that we did feel. And the more you play this game, and once you start getting out of the outside areas, you'll find that 720p will just destroy you on this CPU and this GPU setup. The input lag makes the game pretty much unplayable. Though it doesn't look too bad at the moment with me, there's gun battle with this car in front of me, but the input lag was making it very, very difficult and very frustrating. Now, most of the benchmarks we did today were in the outside areas, so it was more of the worst case scenario with the benchmark, but they didn't move around too much. The game played pretty much the same consistently for each resolution. Now, the frame rates that we got for 1280 by 720, average frame rate was 24.7 frames per second, minimum frame rate fell to 9.3 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit 43.1, which is actually kind of good. And our 0.1% lows was 4.3 frames per second, which is not too great, but it's not too bad either. Now, slipping back to 1024 by 768, running everything at lowest details. Now, the game didn't look too much more terrible than the 720p until you had a view outside the car. Now, the input lag definitely reduced. It became something a bit more playable, but still just not exactly right. Now, our frame rates for 1024 by 768 with Cyberpunk, average frame rate was 24.6 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 15 frames per second. Maximum frame rate we hit 40.2 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit 7 frames per second. Now, laying down everything on the table, Cyberpunk running on this machine is not a great experience. This is such a good immersive game just to get yourself wrapped up in and get lost. But I'm afraid if you have a setup like this, you're just going to get frustrated. Now, the game is somewhat playable. And I guess it comes down to what your definition of playable and what's not playable. Now, this, in my books, is not playable. Now, the frame rate wasn't too bad, but the input lag was what made it cross that line to become unplayable. Now, if you're missing instructions, that's probably a bad precursor. So now those AVX instructions pretty much only started from Standard Bridge onwards on the Intel lineup. So this is pretty much a sign that this was going to be not a great experience. So the CPU did bottleneck, and so that the GPU probably needed to be a lot better as well, as we could see that the whole time the GPU was sitting at 99%. Now, I do wonder what would fix that input lag up, if it's going to be a better GPU or better CPU or better combination. Now, that's all we got for today for the OFFbit for our Cyberpunk special. Unfortunately, it wasn't as great as we thought it would be, but that's how it is sometimes. Anyway, if you've liked this video, please hit that like button. Now, if you want to see more of these videos and you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you in our community. And don't forget to leave any comments. I love reading them. I love to find out what you guys are thinking and what you guys would like to see in the next videos. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. That's us today. We'll catch you guys next time on the OFFbit.